I'm Matt Treadwell, and welcome to the Fireside Chat. I'm a member of the Technical Committee of the Captain's Table, and today we'll sit down with Paul Dean and Tom Walters of Holman, Fenwick, Willan. So we want to learn more about how Holman, Fenwick and Willan has benefited from being a sponsor of the Captain's Table, and open up the conversation about the technology, innovation and the environmental impact in the maritime industry. So let's hear what they have to say. So first of all, maybe we could just go into a bit of an introduction about yourselves, your roles within HFW. So maybe we start with Tom.
Yeah, sure, it's fine. I'm a partner within the shipping team. I've been at the firm for about 20-something years, don't give away my age. I started out with a technical background and then retrained as a lawyer. And I'm now involved with a lot of the shipping aspects from casualty response right the way through to the tech side of things, autonomous shipping, cybersecurity, and a lot of the developments in technology we're now seeing in the shipping sector.
That's great. And Paul?
Yeah, so Paul Dean, I have the grand title of Global Head of Shipping at HFW, which is it's a huge privilege to have that role. I joined, I confess, 36 years ago.
Wow.
So man and boy. And actually my background is my step-grandfather was a Greek ship owner. And I used to play golf with him, and he would talk to me about his ships. And he would never talk to my grandmother about his ships because she would ask questions. And I was just a young teenager and I would just listen. And anyway, he introduced me to what was then known as Holman, Fenwick and Willan in the mid 80s, and the rest is history. But in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis, it's the management of the group globally. We have 250 lawyers in 21 offices, and we cover everything through the life cycle of a ship, from its design all the way through to its recycling and anything that may possibly happen to it. We're fortunate to be recognised as the #1 shipping firm in the world.
So to start with, I mean, the amount of knowledge and experience HFW has is tremendous for a lot of these startups, because a lot of these startups don't have access to the knowledge bank that you guys have access to. So, first of all, thank you for being, big sponsors for the Captain's Table, because without you, there are potentially a lot more barriers that a lot of these startups have to go through in order to actually get out there in front of the clients in the maritime space.
Yeah, so I think there are a few things that come out of that. I think the first is that as a business, we want to invest in the future. We want to give something back to those who are coming into it, those who are new. And yes, it is fair to say that we have a lot of knowledge that we believe can help them. But I think innovators, where they suffer at the beginning is in relation to the financial wherewithal to be able to afford lawyers to ensure that they have contracts which are there to protect them. So what they unfortunately do is they have to take shortcuts in relation to their contracts, and then they may be fine, absolutely fine, but everybody at some point will encounter a problem. And then you look to the terms of the contract. The first thing you ask for is to have a look at the contract. Is it protecting them or not? And I think that's where we can add huge value to the innovators in the sponsorship that we do for them.
So if we look into how HFW got involved with the Captain's Table, maybe you can explore what sort of discussions you had initially.
Yeah, so where it began was we had a consulting arm, HFW Consulting, which was run by Chris O'Callaghan, who sadly is no longer with us. He's now in Australia. Good luck to Chris. And he was first involved with the Captain's Table doing the boot camps and supporting the innovators really from a consulting perspective. And then he came to me, I think, probably after the first event. So we've sponsored it initially as HFW Consulting, and then HFW, the law firm, came in for the next year. So after the year when Grey Wing won and Cyber Owl came second. So that's when we came in as the lawyers to support the Captain's Table.
That's brilliant. And if we look at the startup scene, How does your company's values and mission statement sort of align with the captain's table?
In a number of respects, maybe I can pick one or two. I think the first thing is that we will always try and help those at the beginning of their journeys, whether it's those who are beginning their journeys with HFW or whether those who are beginning their journeys in the maritime industry. We want to try and help people. And particularly with startups, what we are trying to do is become their trusted advisors at the very early stages, and that then we can grow with them. As they become more and more successful, hopefully we can benefit them and us, of course. At the end of the day, it's a mutual journey for both of us.
Yeah. And do you see over the, say, 5 years that the captain's table has run, have you seen any sort of transition or trend in terms of the different types of startups that are coming through?
The teams, the companies that have been coming through, the individuals have got very specialist technical backgrounds. We see a range of projects, products that are coming through. I think it's being underpinned by changes in legislation, regulation. There's all sorts of things that are coming out at the moment. But yes, I mean, technology I think is key to all of it.
And if you were to pinpoint sort of the major challenges, what would you say are the major challenges that a lot of these startups currently face?
So I think one other thing that's interesting that Tom has just mentioned is technology tends to be in advance of where legislation and the law is. So what we are always trying to do is to think ahead as to what the problems will be and therefore what the solutions may be. So I think that is one of the things that's really at the heart of it.
Yeah, and regulations, as Paul says, the technology is way in advance of where the regulations are. When you look at some of the projects that we've done with autonomous vessels and what the IMO is trying to achieve, the tech is far in advance of the IMO regulations and where we are at the moment, and we hope to play a part in providing insight for our clients into what's going to happen in the future and solutions.
Exactly. I think it's also important to maybe highlight the companies and sort of just give a short description so people know who these companies are. So back in 2020 we obviously had Greywing, which was very timely due to the pandemic. Greywing was there to help the seafarers get on board and, more importantly, get off the vessels. So it's all about the logistic chain. And obviously at the same year, Cyber Owl, they were the one that came second, which was fantastic. You guys managed to set up that partnership. And then in 2021 we had 13 Mari, which was a shark fin technology helping to improve the fuel efficiency on board the ship. 2022 Clearbot, which is the autonomous vessels. And then in 23 we had 123 Carbon, which is all about the carbon offsetting or insetting, should we say, which was also a new term that's now sort of filtering through from a regulatory space. So can we reflect on that experience that you've learned through this journey and what type of support services you've provided to them to date?
They've all approached their requirements and their dialogue and conversation with us in a very different way. Some of the startups are very focused on what they want out of their legal support and what they need from us in terms of contractual advice, looking at insurance, advice in relation to IP, how to protect that. Others are much more focused. They know exactly what they need. They're looking at the corporate governance. They're thinking ahead. They're looking at structures for growing their companies and growing their products. So it very much varies depending on where each of the startups are in their sort of journey and on the life cycle.
Could you consider some of the challenges that these startups have faced?
So I think the best example which comes to mind is Clearbot. And during the Q&A session at the finals, they were asked about insurance and the liabilities that they faced. And the lady who was presenting couldn't answer the question. And the answer to the question actually relates to the history of this particular firm, which is liability insurance. This firm was created by the Holman family, but they also created the first P&I club. So what I was able to do was to contact Clearbot and say, I can give you the solution to your insurance issue and effect an introduction to the Ship Owners Club. And they're now entered with the Ship Owners Club for their liability insurance. So it's not just about, we're not just here to provide legal solutions. We have a Rolodex of contacts throughout the industry where we can put people together and say, here's a solution for you. So it's not just confined to that.
Wow, that's fantastic. How do you currently evaluate then the success rates of the engagements that you've had with the finalists?
I think there are two ways in which you measure it. One is how successful the business has become. And I think the trajectory of the companies varies. In terms of them requiring legal support, it is very early days. And we don't see what we do in terms of our sponsorship as a short-term solution for HFW. It is not like that. It's very much something that is for the future. I talked about becoming trusted advisors. To become a trusted advisor takes years and years and years. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It could be 10, 20, 30 years. That's what we're looking to achieve.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I suppose really one of the other areas with startups is regulation. Is regulation keeping up with innovation and technology, or do we need to really think about how we maybe need to look at rewriting regulation?
It's a very good question. I mean, there are some arguments that regulation is stifling entrepreneurialism and development. But if you're talking certainly in the marine sector, you're talking about lots of international legislation and conventions, and changing that takes years. So, as Paul said earlier on, our role is to almost horizon scan and to try and advise the startups on where we think there may be issues for them in terms of problems coming up, legal issues, and try and provide solutions to that. And the second part of what we do is also to try and help a lot of these startups to develop, to lobby, and to try and push through the change that is needed to be required in order to make the ideas that they've got more mainstream. Autonomous vessels is a prime example. We're seeing very slow developments at an international level, but at an industry level, you've got self-regulation, you've got guidelines coming in for owners, for operators of autonomous vessels that have been put in place by the companies themselves that they're offering and are adhering to. So, a lot of the work we do there is a mix between helping with the regulatory side and helping at a much more sort of lower level to help these companies grow.
And I think that there's an additional point there, which is that sometimes there are no solutions, and you have to then work with governments to support them writing legislation, and that's what we do as well. So it's all, I would say, it's all aspects that we're trying to help. And as Thomas said, technology is way ahead in a lot of respects, and some of the regulators are a bit of a block in terms of that progress, and it causes frustration, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
So if we were to look at the regulation aspects in maritime, and it's maybe considered then reactive if it's not keeping up with obviously the technology that's available, what's your view in terms of the steps that would need to take in order to make regulation more possibly proactive, would you say?
Okay, so I can think of a good example in relation to proactive, which is in relation to emissions. And the shipping industry, the maritime industry, has been seen as a polluter, or is observed as a polluter. So there's a lot of focus in relation to how shipping can adjust to that, going back to at least 2020, when you had the emissions clauses and you've got ETS and all of those developments. But I think what the industry is doing, and this is fascinating, is in some ways they're looking back at history to see how history dealt with clean energy. And you've now got ships with sails.
Yep.
And I went to an event at the Mansion House, and the Princess Royal was giving a presentation, and very cheekily she was talking about clean shipping, and she said, well, why don't we have sailing ships? And we're seeing it.
Yep.
For example, with Cargill, they've invested in sailing ships, and I just think that for me is an example of being proactive, but in some ways you're looking back at history and going, okay, well, there's a lot to learn by looking back.
I totally agree with that, because okay, with the survey regime that's placed on board ships today, that hasn't changed since 1760, and yet we are not building ships with wood anymore. So if you look back at the survey regime of a ship, the reason for it having an annual survey, intermediate survey, special survey every 5 years, the annual survey was required in order to check that the corkage was still intact, which you find on wooden ships, not on ships today. Then you have an intermediate, which is a bit more in depth. Then you have a special survey where you replace all your corkage. So, as you say, we're going back in terms of the technologies. And if we go not that far back into 1970s, we used to have nuclear commercial operating vessels, one of which is currently a museum called the Savannah in the Americas. So what's your view then in terms of, we're seeing a lot of the wind assist technologies. What other technologies are you starting to see as being more prominent?
This is the bit that gets, I think, a lot of us quite excited. Nuclear fuel, I think, has to be on the agenda in order to meet the to reduce our emissions as a sector, as a maritime sector. It has to be on the agenda. A lot of the discussion about nuclear fuel is always about the dangers, the issues that happen, the issues like Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. You mentioned nuclear fuels, that's immediately what people springs to mind. And changing that perception is going to take time. But the technology is already there. We're looking at 5th or 6th generation nuclear reactors, small modular reactors that use molten salt that could be fitted to vessels. And I think the IMO was addressed very recently about how they are going to change to accommodate nuclear powered vessels into the mainstream fleet. And again, the technology, as I say, is there, but we're having to adjust our thinking with rules, regulations in order to accommodate it. But it will come, it'll take time. That's one aspect. Autonomous vessels, we've already touched upon, with Paul talking about the work we've done with Clearbot, but we're seeing a lot of other insurers, operators, charterers now. We've been involved in drafting an autonomous vessel ship management contract. So the work for us is coming through from lots of different directions. And then in terms of the digitalisation of shipping, the work there is huge. The amount of data that can now be gathered from a vessel, because the low Earth orbiting satellites are now more freely available, more cost effective. Starlink, what Starlink has done for communications is unbelievable. The amount of data that can be collected is huge, and we're having to contend with all of this, and as you said, in a very short space of time. But I think that there are some very exciting projects coming along, and we're just starting to see the very tip of the iceberg.
It was just before there's something that resonated that you're talking about in relation to surveys and going back to 18th century surveys and the periods. And the one thing that occurred to me is, of course, you look at surveys now, and a lot of surveys are done by drones.
Yeah.
And the drones are going in the holds, for example, or it could be offshore. So there's so much happening that's, I think, incredibly exciting. It really is incredibly exciting.
And the drone aspect is obviously another area when it comes to regulation, at how it's not keeping up with the technology development. So in the pitch challenge that the startups go through, could you just talk about what guidance you typically provide in that, so that for those startups that are looking to maybe go towards the captain's table to pitch their product, innovation or technology, to give them sort of an advanced understanding of the complexity that goes on behind the scenes before they're placed on stage in front of the industry sector?
Yeah, so we're involved with the boot camp, which I think essentially is a training to help them to prepare for what they're going to pitch to the judges and to the table. And that advice varies from, have you thought about insurance? What contracts have you got in place? To the types of issues they might have to address with IP, different jurisdictional issues. But there's a wide range of things that we try and help with them, corporate governance, practical solutions, practical issues that they may not have necessarily thought of. And a lot of it is encouragement. It's like going in front of a Dragon's Den, a VC, to pitch your product, and it's having, allowing them the time to develop this, having the confidence to be able to present.
Due diligence is incredibly important. For anybody, but particularly for startups, being aware of your counterparts and being aware that at the end of the day you're going to be paid is absolutely vital, because you can do all this work, whatever it may be, and if your counterpart does not pay, as a startup you probably don't have the money to go and chase them all around the world trying to find assets. So I think doing that due diligence at the beginning, understanding who you're really dealing with and making sure at the end of the day you're going to be paid. Don't be frightened to ask for money up front. Don't be frightened to ask for parent company guarantees. These are really crucial. And if you get a pushback from a counterparty that you're considering doing business with, that should be a red flag.
Okay.
And I think that's number one in terms of due diligence.
So that's a good piece of advice for a number of the startups, but also for the companies that they are looking to get involved with as well.
Yeah. And I think the next thing would be the contracts themselves. So when they're doing a deal, it's the champagne moment is always shaking hands, you've done the deal, but then you need to focus on getting it down in writing and making sure that you understand what it is, the shape of the deal. And spending some time on that is really important. And I think coming back to where we, HFW, add value to the captain's table and to the finalists is to be able to say, we can review your contracts. We can make sure that you're not exposed to risks that are unfair. So we're looking to provide balance and support from them in that respect. So I would say that's where we can really, those two things, so that free advice on due diligence and looking through the contracts at an early stage is really, really important. No one wants to have a dispute, but they happen.
Yeah, and I suppose also when you think about that, have you seen sort of differences in the business models that companies have taken, and whether there has been a greater success rate depending upon the business model that's been applied?
That's a good question. It's not something I've really focused on. I don't know. I think
the business models are actually are generally quite simple with startups.
Yeah.
Business models tend to vary when they become more global, and they're looking at, in particular, tax considerations, operating in different countries, those sorts of things. So while they're at an early stage, we don't tend to see that.
Okay.
But as companies evolve, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because also people look at equity stakes, or whether they have a subscription base, or whether they have a payment performance agreement. I think one of the typical challenges at the moment is for the hardware companies, the capex tends to be quite high. So how can they get access to the funds to install that technology on board initially? Because a ship owner doesn't necessarily directly benefit by investing in the technology, it tends to be the charterer. So how can you create a situation where the owner benefits? Now you could say, well, installing the technology makes your asset more attractive to charterers, therefore your uptime is increased. But some ship owners may not necessarily want to just focus on that one element. They want to see sort of a joined up approach in terms of taking risk and reward.
I think that's true. Clearly across the world there are different types of ship owners, and there are some ship owners who are willing to spend a lot of money on research and development and to invest in it, and they observe startups and innovators and think, okay, they can add value to what we're doing. But there are others who will look to, who are at the other end of the scale. So why should I invest in this? I'll wait until somebody else has done it and then I'll piggyback it. So there really is a broad spread.
Based on your experience to date with the Captain's Table, what advice and guidance would you give to potential sponsors who are looking to support the Captain's Table, and also then the startups, if this is the right platform for them?
So I think in terms of sponsors, I think all of us who are involved in the maritime industry, wherever we appear in it, and the maritime industry is vast. It really is. If you think that in terms of global trade, 95% by volume is carried on a ship, it's pretty big. So there are lots of different elements to it. I think all of us owe something to the industry to give something back, and I think that's where the sponsorship comes in. In terms of the startups themselves, I think to some extent I've already answered that. I think it's about picking something that is relevant at that time or relevant in the immediate future. But there is so much that's going on at the moment, and it's very fast-paced. Things are evolving literally day by day. So, yeah, it's exciting times.
It is very exciting. So any final thoughts or information, insight, knowledge that you would like to share with the Captain's Table?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the team behind Captain's Table are fantastic. The enthusiasm that they bring to it it's infectious when you meet them. And I think that really comes across, and I think that buoys those who are involved, the judges, the sponsors, the innovators who use that platform. So I think that their commitment to it is fantastic, really, really is fantastic. And actually, in some ways, it's a bit of a shame that it's just in Hong Kong. I know they're trying to explore other geographies. For example, Posidonia, they're at Posidonia. Yeah. They're trying to do something in Singapore as well, I think. So it would be nice if it was more global, because shipping is truly global. It's not just confined to Asia, for example. So I think that is what I would like to see them do.
Yeah, I think I'd encourage anybody who's thinking about it or just wondering whether they should put in an application and to pitch something, to go for it. Have the confidence, have the belief, and to pitch the idea. You just don't know. You don't know. As Paul says, it's about pitching the right idea that is, the right idea for the right moment. And there's an element of luck, but there's an element of how you persuade people. But I think I'd encourage people, anybody who's thinking of it and wavering, just to ignore the naysayers and have a go.
Those are nice conclusions. I think where I come from is, first of all, I would like the Captain's Table to keep going from strength to strength. Each year I see them growing, reaching more people. So in that respect, all of those innovators who are going through the Captain's Table, getting to the final, whether they win or not, they're being exposed to more and more people. So I hope they can continue to grow. I think that's really, really important. And the next thing I would say from an HFW perspective is that we remain committed to the Captain's Table. It's a huge pleasure for us to not only see how the Captain's Table is evolving itself, but also to observe all of those who've gone through the Captain's Table and gone on to success. Long may it continue.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's great. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
So if you want to learn more about the Captain's Table and how Holman, Fenwick, Willan are supporting the maritime industry, click the link in the description, and see you next time.